All right, the recording is now started, and we will start Unit 6, the Industrial Revolution. So, if you remember where we left off, we talked about last time the Civil War and Reconstruction. So, the main takeaway from Civil War and Reconstruction is that the North they won the war, but the South won Reconstruction. And that is where we will start. So, the Age of Invention. This is a term that describes the prior years of the Industrial Revolution that you should know. So the Age of Invention is basically all these new things are getting invented. I'm sure all of you know Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison invents the power plants. He invents the light bulb. He basically invents the DC or the AC, the alternating current and electricity as we know it today. It's like the first sort of years of industrial revolution. So we're in like 1860, 1870 right now. So the Age of Invention, it gives us opportunities for mass production. So basically the Age of Invention will make the inventions that lead to the Industrial Revolution, and especially the factory movements and sort of the mass production, assembly line production that we see start to form. They went over there. Nate and Devin, I think is his name. They went over there somewhere. I don't know where. So we start to see the sort of emergence of what will be called economies of the scale. So basically, a summary of economies of the scale is that the lower your costs based on the inventions and cheap labor, the cheaper the product. The cheaper the product, the more goods you can sell. So your profit goes up for the more goods you are producing. So this allows people like Andrew Carnegie and Rockefeller to make loads and loads of money because they are producing products in such excess, and they were producing such gigantic forms of products.
Did you want me to stay here?
If you have anything to add, you could.
Yes. Yeah, so did you already talk about the vertical and the horizontal?
No, that's we're going to get to that on the next slide.
The idea of economies of scale is just the idea that when you produce at a larger quantity, you are able to produce more efficiently. So if, for example, like if you ever watch like Shark Tank, like they'll use the expression, "Do you think this will scale?" What they're saying is like, you're making it right now in your garage and it costs you $20 a unit to make, you could sell it for $40. If we were to produce millions of them, how cheaply could we produce it? Right? So like the more we produce, the more efficient we can make use of the resources, and we could drive down the cost per unit. So if we can get the cost per unit down to like $3 a unit, we could still sell it for $40. Like we're not increasing the price. All we're doing is by making more of it, much, much, much more of it, we're driving down the price and our profit can go up. Economies of scale take advantage of large production. Thank you.
So in this unit as well, we'll see the sort of rise of captains of industry, as they'll be called by their friends, and robber barons, as they're called by their enemies. So these people, Rockefeller and Carnegie, are seen by captains of industry in some sects and robber barons in others. So we start to see the formation of assembly line production. So I'm sure all of you are well aware, assembly line production is basically one worker makes this, passes it along, another worker makes something else, they start to assemble it, and basically one person's making one thing, and you're getting one big product out of it. So for Ford, will become, so cars basically, one person makes the engine, one person's making the tires, one person's making sort of the interior of the car, and then you just all assemble them, and it's much, much more efficient than what used to be for production-wise. So we're going to see a large manufacturing boom take place during the Industrial Revolution. So the the assembly lines are also very, very dangerous at this time. There are rarely any safety precautions because the people want to maximize profit. So there is 500,000 injuries to workers a year during the Industrial Revolution. So people are getting hurt, sometimes not even their fault, and they're losing their jobs and they're losing their lives sometimes. So this will be the sort of seeds that will sow the labor movement of the latter part of the century. So corporate consolidation as well starts to take a hold. So as these companies get richer and richer, they're able to consolidate their power. They're able to become more powerful. So this is sort of the vertical and horizontal integration that we'll get into on the next slides. So also know the Supreme Court in the United States during the Industrial Revolution was very, very pro-business. They would usually always side with businesses, and they would usually interpret law to benefit the businesses of the time. Holding companies are another sort of thing that will start to form out of the Industrial Revolution and out of this corporate consolidation, with these holding companies controlling enough stock of to have a controlling force in production, factories, transportation, all of these things. So holding companies have basically a monopoly over what they produce. So a big holding company and a big monopoly that we'll get to is Standard Oil by Rockefeller, that will get broken up by the United States of America. So monopoly, again, it is one holding company that controls sort of all of the production. So for example, I think it is 1866, I believe, maybe 67, the EC Sugar Company, EC Knight, they own 98% of the sugar refining plants in the US. So this would be considered a monopoly. And we'll get to the court case that deals with this, but basically the Supreme Court says they're not a monopoly, but they are. So that kind of shows how pro-business they were at the time. So horizontal versus vertical integration. One is legal, one is not. So horizontal integration is illegal, while vertical integration is legal. These were very common practices during the Gilded Age, and horizontal integration leads to the formation of monopolies, as we just talked about. So basically what each of them is horizontal integration is owning all of the sort of trades, all of the business of that certain product. So for Standard Oil by Rockefeller, Rockefeller owned over 99% of all the oil bought and sold in the United States. So Rockefeller could raise and lower prices as he pleased. While another example of vertical integration, not necessarily in the actual industrial revolution, but today, is sort of Coca-Cola. So Coca-Cola owns their manufacturing plants, they own their production plants, they produce everything from the bottle all the way to the liquid. So that is a legal form of integration, and that is something that takes a hold in the latter part of the century. Yeah, John Kim? So an example in the Industrial Revolution, I mean, I'm looking for, it's Swift Premium. So Swift Premium is a beef company. They control the stockyards, the slaughterhouse, and the process of packaging all plants, and sort of they control the processing packaging plants, but they still have to compete with other companies. So think of vertical integration as still competing with other companies, while basically horizontal integration is where you have no competitors. So you can raise and lower prices at your will. Moscow, you got a question? Cool. So in response to all this terrible business practices that's going on, that's very harmful to the people, the government passes the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. Just know this Trust Act is very, very ineffective, and it actually is used against the labor movement, not for. So the government passes the act because of the rapid growth that's required a lot of money based on the actual businesses. Businessmen borrowed huge sums from the government, and if these businesses failed, they couldn't pay these loans back, and these would lead to financial crises and financial panics. So an example we could use today is like the 2008 housing market crash. A lot of the housing market borrowed a lot of money for the banks, went out of business, couldn't pay it back, so our economy went into a terrible bear and it crashed. Another thing is there is one major financial panic a decade. So just know financial panics were very, very common for this time, and there would be one about every single decade. So our economy is not the most stable now, and it's a very sort of hub of instability and sort of crashes, bulls, bears, those sort of things. So monopolies created a class of extremely powerful men whose interests clashed with the public. So the interest of the country and the interest of the public was constantly clashing with the business owners who wanted to exploit the people so they could keep the prices down and make the cheapest product and gain the most amount of money. Yeah, Moscow? So we'll get to that. So so public resentment increased. Basically, the public was like, what are these business people doing? I hate them. And the government was forced to respond. They responded in form of the Sherman Antitrust Act. So the exact wording of the Sherman Antitrust Act is the combination or conspiracy in restraint of free trade is a monopoly. So this obviously is very, very ambiguous wording. Like the Sherman Antitrust Act is like literally a paragraph. So it's a response from the government that was like they felt they had to do it, but they knew it really wouldn't do anything. So our actual antitrust laws don't really get into place until Roosevelt and Wilson. So the wording of combination of conspiracy, this is used against the labor unions instead of actually being used against the businesses. Yeah.
So was the government kind of more in support of these businesses, so they didn't really want the whole thing?
Yeah, so a majority of the government and Congress at the time were pro-business because basically not they were being paid off, but there was a lot of incentives for politicians to sort of side with these businesses because of the money they were making and the economic boom they were sort of giving for the country. Yeah.
All right, so back to the business part of huge chunks if their business fails, banks could do. So is that would be the reason why like the economy could have just
Yeah, it crashed basically once every 10 years.
Carnegie or however you pronounce it, since he's like an individual, and he had so much money and power, he messed up and everything could go down.
Yeah. Exactly. So the modern phrase is too big to fail, and obviously it doesn't work out, and that's not true. So every business can basically fail. John Kim, you got a question? Okay. So a major Supreme Court case, you basically don't have to know it off the top of your head, but really just shows how pro-business the court was, is the U.S. versus E.C. Knight company. So the E.C. Knight company is the company that owned all these 98% of sugar refineries in the United States. And the Supreme Court said because of that 2% that the court couldn't call it a monopoly. So basically the court was increasingly pro-business and that was sort of their stance. Yeah, Moscow?
Pro-business and
well, not anti-business, but so there's pro-business and then pro-regulation of the businesses. So does the government have the right to sort of step in and regulate these businesses?
Oh, so does the government have the right to take down
the monopolies and those sort of things that are coming?
Horizontal?
Yeah, the horizontal. So horizontal monopolies. Yeah.
That'd be like breaking up monopolies.
Yeah, breaking up monopolies.
So what exactly horizontal integration is legal? I understand it's legal.
So let me try to think of something.
It's like
running people out of business.
Someone give me like a product. Give me something like people make.
cocaine,
Bleach. Cars. Yeah, before.
Cars?
Yeah.
So cars, right? So boom, that's a car. Whatever. So the product of making a car, right? You first have to harvest the resources. You have to harvest the resources. Then you have to make the parts. And then you have to kind of assemble them into the actual car. So owning all these plants from scarce resources to the actual finished product, this is vertical.
It's like urging,
Yeah.
owning a certain engine, I guess, would be an example of vertical, or certain parts.
So you're not skipping any steps, so you're doing vertical.
So horizontal is like this. So imagine if I owned every single, I'm not spelling that right, but imagine if I owned every single car brand ever. So I own all the cars that exist on the market. So this is a horizontal. So I can raise these prices as much as I want because I own all the cars in the market. I set the determining price of the cars.
So can I do the same thing?
You're driving competition.
You can't do it.
Yeah, so I have no competition here because I own all the competition, right? For this, I still have competition with maybe another person who's making a car like this or a box car or something like that. I'm still competing with those people, but for this, I own all of the cars on the market, so I can raise and lower the prices as I want. So this is this is a monopoly.
All right, so now an example would be like PlayStation owning certain like
Xbox.
games and companies that can only be for PS4.
Nah, it's
So
No, it's like
PS4 and Xbox.
it's
No, I'm
like
saying for
think
If
of
someone owned PS4, Xbox, like
No, but
Nintendo.
for
think
vertical.
of so a good example of monopoly that we actually did break up was Microsoft. So Microsoft owns what? They own what? They own PowerPoint, right? They own Word. They own like their Excel thing.
Mojang.
Yeah, Mojang.
Mojang, they own Mojang.
Yes. So they own all these things, and so this is like that's a lot of stuff they control in the market. So basically, they controlled the whole tech sector, and so we broke them up into separate companies. So that is sort of dealing with horizontal
Say you
integration.
own a monopoly, right? And they break it up, you can lose money. You lose
I mean, you're obviously losing money if
Well,
they break up your
obviously, like,
business.
you lose assets,
Yeah, that's literally you losing assets.
Dumb question.
Master, you're confused?
All right, so wait, but for the vertical, would it be like PS4, like PlayStation owning the games?
So it's like Coca-Cola. So Coca-Cola, they own the mines where they get the sort of like glass and sort of those things. They own the refineries where they make the sugar and those kind of things. They own the packaging plants. They own the harbors where they ship. They own the trucks that they ship it in, and they control all of sort of their sector of the actual, like, from minerals to finished product. That's vertical. Horizontal is owning everything that it falls under your sector in the market. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
Cool. So Andrew Carnegie, as some people like to say, will be sort of our captain of industry and most notable person of the period. So know who Andrew Carnegie is. He is a big proponent of social Darwinism. Who knows what social Darwinism is? Yeah, Torres? From last year.
So wasn't it saying that like since like everybody's microevolution, basically people in power were empowered because they were genetically superior to those who were like low, like
Kind of, not really. So social Darwinism is the belief that just as in nature, it's survival of the fittest, both in business, it's also survival of the fittest. So poor people will die out and the rich will sort of triumph and conquer. That's not really what you were saying. You were talking about genetics. Yeah, you were a little off. So another thing of Andrew Carnegie is the gospel of wealth. So the gospel of wealth basically says like philanthropy. Like the rich people should fund public libraries. They should fund public museums. They should fund some public welfare programs. It's not charity, so don't get those confused. He's not giving money out on the streets. He's funding libraries. He's funding schools. Like that's something rich people should be doing. That was his belief. Yeah, Carnegie. So the next sort of thing is child, woman, and immigrant labor. So child labor and immigrant labor becomes a big part of the Industrial Revolution. So these titans of industry are hiring all these kids and all these immigrants because they can pay them much, much lower wages than they have to pay their workers. So they can pay them bare minimum wages and still reap heavy, heavy profits in it. So it's reduced costs and maximizing profits. So thus, all these poor people sort of lived in the cities. These poor women, children, and immigrants lived in the cities. So we see an uptick in poverty, crime, disease, and a rapidly expanding population of poor people in urban cities, in factory cities. So mass transportation in these cities like subways, railroads, those sort of things allow the middle class to move out of the cities but still commute for work. So they can move out of the sort of poor neighborhoods of the cities and still get to work on time each morning. So we could sort of see a middle class and upper class flock from the poor parts of the city into the more wealthy parts of the city based on mass transportation. Yeah, Jimmy?
Were a majority of these urban cities in like the northern areas?
Yeah, so a majority of them are in the northern areas. If you remember from the Reconstruction, most of the industry is concentrated in the north. That's just based on the sort of railroads and sort of those things that really transpire, and also cultural things, obviously, too. So we see a shift between old and new immigration. So old immigration came from places like Britain, France, Germany. Those are the old immigration places. This new immigration that will form, they come from Italy, they come from Spain, they come from Greece, Serbia, Eastern Europe. So these Southern and Eastern Europe immigrants, they are not wealthy. They are sort of poor immigrants looking for a better future. So they come into the Americas poor, and they sort of live in these ethnic neighborhoods. So people, especially immigrants, lived with their own kind, sort of. So there was an Italian neighborhood, a Puerto Rican neighborhood, El Barrio, based on last year, obviously, and there is a Irish neighborhood. So tenements were also a pretty major living situation thing for most people. They lived in utter disarray. Like, it would be 5 cents for like this little nook and cranny in a house. People would literally be living on the street. Basically, just tenements were terrible living situations. Like in this room, for a tenement, they'd fit like 100 beds in here, like 5 cents a bed. So, like, I mean, if you could imagine like 100 beds in this room right now, people living in utter disarray, yeah, it's crazy, right? So old is sort of the rich Englishmen, Frenchmen, Germans, Dutch who come in. The new immigration is the poor Southern Italians, not Irish. Irish are the poor people. New. So new is the Irish, the Italians, the Greece, the Greek, the Serbians, sort of those Eastern European regions. They're poor. They come to the country for a better life. So if you know, on Ellis Island, obviously, the Statue of Liberty says, "Give me your poor, give me your sick, give me your betrothed," stuff like that. They're talking about the new immigrants. So Italians, Irish, Russians. So the political bosses of these cities, especially, that's what I said. So especially New York, we'll talk about. It is groups of corrupt men who provide service for these people. So these people who are living in utter disarray, certain people like Boss Tweed, for example, comes in and says, "Here's a job I found for you. Here's some food for you." And in exchange for this, all they would expect to do is vote for these political bosses in the next election. So in exchange for their vote, they would be given goods and services. So this is literally bribery. So the political machine, obviously what I just discussed, people would be given goods and services in exchange for a vote. So William Boss Tweed, who I just mentioned, he is the leader of the New York Democratic Party in the city. He runs Tammany Hall, one of the most corrupt organizations and sort of center of politics in the city. And yeah, John Kim.
Is that Democratic Party like today's?
It's still like the Dixiecrat, like low taxes, low tariffs party.
Is that like today's?
No.
That's
No,
like
the
today's-
party switch happens in the 60s.
Oh, okay.
So Thomas Nast gives us this very cool cartoon where he describes Boss Tweed in his sort of notorious outfit and with a money bag as his head, because all he cares about is money. Yeah, the reason Boss Tweed actually gets captured in Spain is because of Thomas Nast's drawings. So people recognize Boss Tweed from the drawings of him, and that's how he actually gets convicted and sent back to the United States.
Can you explain the Tammany Hall?
So it's basically the hub of the political machine and the political bosses in New York City. It's like imagine if the New York mayoral office was really, really, really corrupt. I think it's kind of still it's not Tammany Hall.
It's like all the mob bosses. Well, they're not
Mob bosses in the sense that it's like the political bosses, then yes. So in obvious response to all these terrible labor practices, the labor movements start to show up. So we get the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor, you should know, because it is it is the first nationwide labor movement available to all workers. So unskilled and skilled workers could be part of this union. They reached their peak in about 1886 and then declined shortly after. So the Knights of Labor, they lead sort of the Haymarket Square riots. So the Haymarket Square riots are in response to wage cuts and factor and hour raises from I think it's Terrence Powderly. So he decreases the wages, and so the workers go on strike. These strikes escalate to riots, and eventually a bomb goes off in the city, killing numerous women and policemen. This, you should know, it is a drastic hit for the labor movement's public support. So after this, public support for the labor movement sort of decreases and sort of disbands itself. Public support declines. So the Pinkerton Defense Force is a force of union busters who would break up the labor movements and get people off the strike, off the picket fence, we call it, and into the factories. So they would bust up the strikes, bust up the unions for these big businessmen, and get workers back into the factories. Another political party that starts to rise out of all these movements is the American Socialist Party. So the American Socialist Party is inspired by the writings of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the Communist Manifesto. So Eugene V. Debs leads the Socialist Party, and his communist sort of thinking gained some popularity in the United States, especially in the labor movement. Another labor movement you should know is the American Railway Union. So the American Railway Union is the union of all railroad workers in the United States who want to apply for the unionship. Know the Pullman strike. So basically, Pullman cuts the wages, and high rent forced the workers to go on strike. So 250,000 workers on the railroads go on strike, and they walk off their jobs. In order to break up these sort of strikes, Grover Cleveland, president at the time, calls in the army, who used the Sherman Antitrust Act to say that the workers walking off their jobs is violating the free trade status of the railroads. And he causes the military to pull off the sort of railway workers. So if you can see in this bottom image here, it is railroad workers basically taking over the railways and striking against Pullman.
So they left their job and then they said that this wasn't right.
So Pullman here, for his workers, he cuts their wages,
Yeah.
and he raises the rent of the places they live in.
Yeah.
So these workers were like, what the hell, that's very, very unfair. And they walk off their jobs. They say, we're no longer going to work for you. So Pullman needs these workers, right? And so basically the major way they get involved is the U.S. Post Office is in our Constitution. So the U.S. Post Office needs those railways to transport posts, letters, and mails across the country. So using our trusty pal, the Sherman Antitrust Act, they say that violating the railroads is a restraint of free trade. So they use the Sherman Antitrust Act against the workers whom it's supposed to help. So they use the wording of the act to break up and justify them controlling the trade of the Americas and the railroads. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it ended up with that whole one.
Yeah, no. The labor movement gets defeated, but still strides are seen with the labor movement. So the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL, also comes out of this. It is the only difference between that and the Knights of Labor is they are skilled workers. So only skilled workers, only people who were like shoemakers, only people who were like machinists or anything like that could join the AFL. So this is our bread and butter unionism. So bread and butter unionism is basically, I deserve at the end of the day to be able to afford a piece of bread and butter, and I deserve to have a home. I deserve to have a livable wage. I deserve to have a subsistence life. So this is where we basically get sort of the minimum wage or livable wage that starts to form. The AFL is pretty successful with this, while it really won't come until the 1910s, 1920s. Yellow journalism, it's kind of like this. It's just journalism that sort of pulls on your emotions more than it actually pulls on the content and the truth. So sort of this, like, how does it make you feel? Who is the bad guy in the situation? while it may not be certainly true, they're not using statistics, they're not using anything like that. They're using your emotions to sort of pull on you and gain your support. So that is yellow journalism. It's kind of a derogatory phrase, but it's what it is called.
Is that a Thomas Nast? Drawing?
Honestly, probably. If you go to any political cartoon from those time periods, probably Thomas Nast.
Nah, it's using emotions to get you like.
Yeah.
To, like, feel a certain way.
Yeah. So Jim Crow laws, when we get to the social issue. So Jim Crow laws and other developments in the South. So it is the crop line system and sharecropping. Who remembers what sharecropping is from last time?
That's
John,
what happened.
Kim, what is sharecropping?
Oh, I don't remember what it was, but I know
What?
slaves after the was it
Emancipation.
Proclamation.
Are those, so it's a noun, it's not an adjective. Yeah, Marcus?
Like after the Reconstruction, they were forced to gather with the other free slaves and like live on some farm.
Yeah. So these people living on the same farms, sharing the same crops and growing these sort of goods, they are subject to the crop line system. So this system is basically slavery. It makes it so that these people have to pay these high rents. They can only sell their goods at a certain price. And it is basically just constricting these people. It's basically just to keep the poor in constant state of debt. So they can't advance social classes. The poor stay poor, the rich stay rich. That is what the crop line system is in the South. Question on that? No? Cool. So Jim Crow laws are put in place after sort of the Civil War and Reconstruction. They're put in place to keep Black people down after all these new rights that were given to them. It is the state's sort of Jim Crow laws that get into place. It makes like literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and poll taxes to limit Black people from voting. So all the rights that sort of Black people gained from the 14th Amendment and the 13th Amendment is slowly being taken away from them in the South, and so they kind of lose the rights that they gained. We really won't see a rise in the civil rights movement until 1965 with Martin Luther King and Malcolm X.
And that's only in the South. The Jim Crow laws?
Yeah, so Jim Crow laws are only in the South. So they're mainly enforced in the South. But like, for example, like in the North, like if like a 16-year-old white woman was killed, like if a 16-year-old white woman was touched by a Black man, that Black man would be killed and lynched because he had touched a white woman. In the North too. So I mean, it's not like the South is like this deep racist place, and the North is like this happy land where Black people live in enlightenment and nirvana. Like, no, there's racism still exists. So the 14th SCOTUS says they get a couple of court cases, and they get cases on the 14th Amendment. So the Supreme Court of the United States says that the 14th Amendment does not apply to Black people. So these sort of naturalization things and sort of the rights that we get from the 14th Amendment, the Supreme Court said that does not apply to Black people and people of color. So the Chinese workers on the railroad, Asian people, they do not have the same rights as white people. I'm not saying that, John Kim. That's just what SCOTUS said.
Yeah, doesn't that sense?
But then why'd you make like the Asian argument?
So Plessy versus Ferguson is one of those court cases that you need to know. If we remember all the three that we've gone over yet, what are the three court cases we need to know? One of them is McCulloch versus Maryland. Marbury versus Madison. So what is Marbury versus Madison?
That one, is that the school district?
No.
That's Boundary for Education.
Yes, you should know that one also.
Marbury Madison.
It starts with a J.
Justice.
No, close.
Justice.
JU,
Judicial Review.
Judicial Review.
Wait, can you explain?
And then
I forgot what those were.
And then you can look at the Quizlet. I'm not taking time now. So McCulloch versus Maryland, what was that?
That one was Torres.
Federal law trumps state law, and then Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal. So Black people, like the Jim Crow laws aren't in violation of the Constitution, because as long as you provide Black people with equal sort of means of living, they are allowed to stay separate. So public goods can stay separate as long as it's equal. So this is where we get like a colored drinking fountain versus a white drinking fountain. So Booker T. Washington, he is a African American progressive who supports segregation. So he basically says that Black and white people should remain separate. Black people should educate themselves. They should innovate themselves, and they need to innovate themselves in order to achieve equality. So he wanted to keep Black and white people separate, wanted to raise Black people up, and that's how they would be equal. W.E. Du Bois is on the opposite side of the spectrum. W.E. Du Bois is a socialist and a Pan-African rights activist. So he starts sort of this movement of African liberation, moving back to the continent of Africa. So the Transcontinental Railroad. So Lincoln promises for his second term after the Civil War, 4 days after he is supposed to be killed, he promises that by the end of this decade, so by the end of 1870, the Transcontinental Railroad will be built. So a lot of Chinese immigrant poor workers work on this railroad, and it does end up getting built by the end of the decade. To get the sort of room for the railroad, they need to kill a lot of Native Americans, and that's what they do. So they force a lot of Native Americans off their land, and this is where we get Little Bighorn. So Little Bighorn is this big battle in sort of the western part of the country. I think it's actually at Sewell, Utah, if anyone's familiar. It's where George Custer dies. You don't need to know who that is. He was just a American general at the time. That is where he dies. So that is like the only battle the Native Americans had actually won. So the frontier thesis is a thesis that Frederick Turner posits. Basically, the frontier experience of Western expansion made American society more democratic, emphasized cheap unsettled land, and the absence of a landed aristocracy. So basically, he's saying that the Western frontier opened up the country to democracy and allowed poor people to achieve a middle-class life that they deserve to live. So if anyone's familiar with Little House on the Prairie, may or may not be, that is sort of the frontier thesis sort of materialized.
Wait, that's like a justification.
Yeah. So this is Manifest Destiny as well, sort of coming to a halt. So the Homestead and Moreland Land Grant are basically the movements to sort of get poor people into the Western frontier and settle those lands. So the Homestead Act, if anyone remembers from the American Revolution, actually, it's sort of like the headright system, where it gave 160 acres of land to people who wanted it for only $30. So these sort of terms you can look up on the Quizlet, and they are there for you to sort of look at and memorize. So the Moreland Land Grant Act is very similar to the Homestead Act, and it allows these people to purchase all this land for $30 and allows the government to sort of survey this land and give this land as it wills so they can complete the railroad. So the Dawn's Severity Act, it's a bill that promised Native Americans parts of land to farm in order to assimilate with white culture. So the bill was resisted, ineffective, and disastrous to Native American tribes. So in order to get Native Americans into Western culture or into white culture, they basically said, you're going to come with us, you're going to live with us, you're going to sort of be with us for a while, and that's the easiest way to get you into white culture. So we see Native American white schools show up, in which like hundreds and thousands of Native American children are literally just killed by school teachers and by like agents of the United States government. It's actually pretty horrendous. They discover mass graves for Native Americans like pretty regularly, actually, on the West. It's pretty bad, but not for our time or purposes right now. So the Gilded Age in national politics. So the Gilded Age is what this sort of unit of the Industrial Revolution is called. So a gilded metal, if anyone's familiar, it is shiny on the inside, but it's really, really cheap on the inside. So the Gilded Age describes America because while America looked really shiny on the outside, looked very prosperous, looked very like innovative, it was really poor. It was really disastrous for the people on the inside. So the presidents of this sort of Gilded Age, you don't have to know them. They're not really significant. They don't really do anything. Just know they focused on civil reform. So these people focused on reforming sort of the civil services, getting rid of the spoil system, if anyone remembers. Jimmy, what's the spoil system?
Spoil system is when you give someone something so they you made an example of me and Andrew. Wait, it was like you treat me better so I vote for you or something.
Yeah, perfect. So in exchange for a job, you vote for me, and if I win the presidency, I give you a job. So the civil service reform that goes on requires a civil service test in order for you to have a government office. So you have to pass a test if you want to be a trash collector. Like the sewage people actually have to pass like a civil service exam before they can collect sewage. Prevent like uneducated people or prevent like unskilled people from working in civil government. So $1 billion Congress is what will also form from this. So $1 billion Congress just describes the sort of Republican policies that go into effect. So they extract like a lot of transportation policies, a lot of welfare policies, a lot of social reform policies, and all these policies lead to a tremendous debt in the United States Treasury. So that's why it's called $1 billion. It's because they detract $1 billion from the deficit. So this is where America sort of resides into that deep debt that we live in now. So railroad regulations, the railroads also get regulated during this time. It is enforced because of price gouging. So the railroads jump up their prices and they want to take advantage of the people riding them. And they know that they can because they're sort of monopoly. So they raise the prices and the government says you can't do that. And then they regulate the railroads. It is one of the first example of a government attempt to get rid of corruption in this sort of era. So regulating of the railroads is sort of us getting out of the political machine and the Gilded Age in that aspect. So national politics at this time, we get the Interstate Commerce Act. So the ICC gets established based on this act. It monitors the business operations of transportation and the people between states. So that's why if we ride the path to New York City, based on the Interstate Commerce Act, our prices they can't get raised, and it is nice, cheap, and easy sort of transportation between states. It is created to regulate those railroad prices. Another thing that comes up is women's suffrage. So Susan B. Anthony will lead the women's suffrage movement and this sort of like hoorah movement for voting for women. So it doesn't get passed until the 19th Amendment of the United States in 1999, but just know the women's suffrage movement is going on. The American suffrage movement wanted state constitutions to make amendments to their own constitutions. So they wanted the states to do it first before the federal government did it. So the grunge movement is another movement that will form. Basically, they want to change the gold standard at the time to including silver as well. So the gold standard is basically what U.S. currency was based on. So a dollar bill would be equivalent to some amount of gold. So in order to sort of balance out the prices and make your dollar worth more, people want to start including silver into the standard. It doesn't work. They don't ever do it, but that's what the movement is about. The grunge movement starts to form, and they sort of migrate, just as the Whig Party is the Republican Party, to the Farmers Alliance. So the Farmers Alliance is an alliance of farmers in the West who sort of band together, sell their crops at one price in order to gain more money from the market. So they say that we're all going to sell this sort of wheat, this sort of grain at one price, so we all can be making a profit from it. So the Populist Party, does anyone know what populism is? So populism is a politician who appeals to sort of the poor people, sort of the disadvantaged people of the time. John Kennedy head up. So William Jennings Bryan becomes a leader of the party. Oh, I didn't mean to you.
Whoa.
So William Jennings Bryan becomes a leader of this party. William Jennings Bryan, if you remember, he's in Inherit the Wind. So William James Ryan was that fat guy who did not like evolution, as he called it, if you remember.
He died.
Good job, Jimmy. That was
Yes, that's what I just said. If you were listening, you'd understand that. So this is the last thing. Foreign policy at the time, it is the McKinley Tariff. So the McKinley Tariff is basically, one second. We have like 2 minutes left. So it is a 50% tariff on imported goods. So that is the McKinley Tariff. It's not very popular, but it's something that exists. The Spanish-Mexican War also happens here. So America basically says, I'm going to help Cuba be free, and so they declare war on Spain. They fight for a little bit, and then at the end of the war, the Americans take the Philippines, and they sort of gain their sort of imperialism, which we'll discuss. Just know also, the Spanish-American War sees a direct increase of U.S. nationalism starting to form. So people are really seeing themselves as Americans and fighting and dying for their country at this time. So the new Navy that will form is saying that we should start building our Navy with battleships and sort of destroyers in order to secure a more broad perspective of the world. So this is where our Pacific Fleet and Atlantic Fleet start to form. So this is why Hawaii comes into fold for us as a military base, especially, and sort of Guam will also. Well, that is the next one. Good job. Good job. So imperialism. The Philippines will come under U.S. control after the Spanish-American War. It is negotiated with the Treaty of Paris. Basically, a kind of belief of the Americans at the time is they had the right and really the duty to civilize and bring civilization to countries. So this was the European excuse for colonialization in Africa, just as the Americans' excuse for colonialization in the Philippines. If anyone remembers Rudyard Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden, he writes that directly after the Philippines annexation with the United States. So the United States basically becomes the overlord of a foreign country very far away. Does that remind you of anything?
Oh, wait. England and Africa?
Oh,
England here.
England and the United States. Crazy. So senators in America are trying to they have a hard time. So senators in the Americas have a hard time trying to justify them annexing Philippines, and it only passes through a 4-vote margin. So 56 senators vote for it, and the rest are against. Yeah, Jack Staff.
I was gonna say, was not good, not English, was like many different countries.
Yeah, the main two are English and France, though. Yes. So the Platt Amendment goes into place as well. The Platt Amendment is an amendment with Cuba, basically saying that the Americans have the right to interfere in any Cuban affairs, and they have a right to control sort of Cuban affairs as well. So while Cuba is its own separate country, it is pretty much a satellite state of the Americas. So the open door policy is a policy under McKinley where he basically takes his big battleships, goes to China, and says, you're going to trade with us whether you like it or not. And he opened up trade with China with the rest of the world. So China locked itself up from the rest of the world before this and says, we're just going to build our own country, we're going to trade with ourselves, and we're going to grow a state of prosperity. They had a lot of prosperity, and then McKinley basically said, knock, knock, let me in. And the Chinese said, no, thank you. And McKinley said, but I have a lot of guns. And so they let him in, and China starts to trade with the rest of the world. This will lead to the Opium Wars, if anyone's familiar, where Britain, in order to make China basically its subject state, floods the country with drugs, like heroin, like literally heroin. So they get the Chinese people, they get the Chinese people hooked on heroin, and they fight 7 Opium Wars. So boxers are the Chinese nationalists of the time. So Japan did not like the U.S. expansion into Hawaii and the Philippines because, especially Hawaii, 50% of the people living in Hawaii were Japanese. So they did not like the U.S. annexation of the Kingdom of Hawaii. So that is where we finished the unit. Congratulations. So unit
2/3 done.
unit 6 is now done. So if you'd like,
Oh, I know this one.
I have review questions as well as I want to talk about the short answer question. So we can do this two ways. We can do this as a class, or you can do this right now individually, and I'll tell you what I think about it.
Marcus, what do you want?
Do your.
Marcus, it's up to you, Marcus.
It's all up to you.
It's all up to you.
It's all on you. It's all on you.
Nice.
Yeah, doing it as a class doesn't mean I help you. That means I just pull you guys together. So someone read the question out loud, please.
Briefly explain the social and economic conditions of the people who live in conditions similar to those in image 1.
Unnecessary.
I was just like, oh, Mr. Keith.
So is the rest of the interlude that is being recorded.
Yeah, it is recorded, by the
It's
way.
going on YouTube.
So, briefly explain the social and economic conditions of the people who lived in the conditions similar to image 1. Before we do that, so much participation. Before we do that, we first have to describe what the hell is happening in image 1. So someone describe to me what image 1 looks like, please. No.
Let's take a tenement.
Let Oldham do it.
Yeah.
Start talking first.
So Oldham, what is it?
So basically, you have a poor family living in a tenement, not very spacious, all living together in one room. Conditions suck, and they're obviously not living too luxuriously.
Okay, so what is John Kim? What is the social or economic? That's what it says, right? Social economic conditions. What are these economic and social conditions?
In image 2?
No, image 1.
They are a poor family.
Oh, really?
Poor
Okay.
family,
They
just
probably
a
work.
smaller room.
So what?
They probably work in sweatshops.
This isn't
Yeah.
Carnegie's family?
Sweatshops? Sure, they were
now.
sweatshops.
Gotta be.
Probably work. in
Minimum
assembly lines.
wages, low wages.
Long hours.
Could you connect this to new immigration, or is that like?
Good job, Marcus.
Yes.
So social would be our new immigration.
Oh, yeah.
Boom! I have perfect
We
handwriting.
obviously would put that like said. Would that be like what 1 point for answering A?
Wait, yeah, how many sentences per point, like per ABC?
2 to 3 sentences for each point, I'd say, honestly. So good job. We described image 1. Perfect. So if you notice, also, it literally does say image 1, family and room in tenement house. So just mentioning tenement is not merely enough to get you sort of this point. What about image 2?
Oh my god.
What are some things that I see?
Let's hear it, Thor. Wait, we need 3 of them?
Torres, I want you to describe. I want you to just describe the image first. What do you see?
I see very luxurious and spacious.
So what does that mean?
Means they were rich, they got a lot of money, they're in the upper class, and possibly were the people who were kind of taking advantage of the people living in tenements.
So this could be our either captains of industry,
Yeah.
or as they're called,
Old
robber barons sometimes.
People that
Could it be considered
people
old
that take
immigration?
over.
Could be new immigration. And old immigration. Sorry.
So what is the economic, social, or what are the economic, social things you can see here? What are some of those?
Probably
Old immigration?
politicians, maybe.
Would it be?
Monopoly.
Business.
Not necessarily, really.
I don't know that I would describe it as old immigration. I can check if they do. I don't. So it's definitely new immigration for the tenement house because that's primarily where those people did actually live. But I don't know if I would necessarily call it as the old immigration for the second image. I would more clearly call it like sort of the rich sort of divide, definitely. Does anyone have Marcus, what is one of the social?
Okay, I have a question.
Yeah.
Can you connect this to like the monopoly since at the bottom it says AT steward of Stewart's department store, and that could be like a business that's like was prevalent, like similar to like Macy's in our own day.
Yeah, so I don't know if maybe monopoly would be the right word, but you could probably definitely connect this to big business, right? Because I see a very, very rich person, and I also see them owning a business in their name. So these are obviously our business owners. Maybe so this is economic, right? So
I have a huge social stretch right now.
so give me a social. Give me a social of them.
Dude, no, I said a politician.
You said what?
Politician.
Don't.
Like one of the
Yeah, but like,
social
yeah, but we're not looking at that. We're looking at that social, like, 250.
All right, Oldham, give me a
So why isn't it fully reached, right? Could it be like one of the social things, like social Darwinism, like survival of the fittest and like the economy maybe?
Yeah, you could definitely connect it to social Darwinism, right? But maybe we might want to do that with C, right? We might want to connect them with C. So maybe we would develop social Darwinism in point C, but if we're just kind of describing point B, we're definitely going to talk about big business owners. So what's the social sort of aspect of that?
There's bad people who exploit others.
Yeah, the other thing is they're rich, so they're not. I know we kind of said it here, but like this also is going to apply here to our social thing as well. Like when I said describe here, you guys kind of already did this part. So I mean, good job. So yeah, Seth, do you have another thing?
I was gonna say going for C.
So what's another thing?
For C, I was gonna say like, well, we were talking about the new and old.
So new and old, yeah, definitely. So for point C, for point C, we could definitely refer to the sort of the new versus old. So let's just do three of them, okay? So 1, 2, 3. So new, the old. Yeah, Taurus?
All right, industrialization and then lowering the wages of the workers in order to raise the wealth of the people, of the business owners, basically.
And so industrial revolution leading to low wages. Is that really?
Yeah, low wages leading basically to the people on top getting richer.
Okay. Yeah. You can definitely describe that.
Profit.
Would you say low wages equals high profit? I mean, you're not wrong.
Did someone say Darwinism?
Social Darwinism, right? We could develop that, I think.
It's like
Darwinism was survival of the
merge
fittest.
from reaction.
That's fine.
I can't read it. Wait, what's the question?
That is not how you spell social Darwinism. I might be actually.
Is it saying like something that emerged from this or something?
So it
else?
says briefly explain one development in the period of post-Civil War, so all the way up leading to the 1940s. So 1940 is sort of the year after the start of the World War II. That can be interpreted as a reaction to the discrepancies in the two lifestyles pictured in each photograph.
Like, can we say like labor movements? Like the Knights of Labor?
You could. How would you bring that up though? How would that develop the discrepancy between the two lifestyles?
I could have read the question wrong. Is it asking something that developed as a result of like the separation?
Yeah.
I think it's describing one development that could be a reaction to the discrepancy. So it would be like it would be something that causes. So we could do kind of like an A for this one that Tora said, like Knights of Labor.
For the social Darwinism, you said that that's the basically the justification of the two, like the basic.
Yeah, so you could definitely bring up like a Carnegie here or something like that. This is not how you spell it, but so Carnegie is social Darwinist. So good. This is a short answer question. We did one. You'd probably get the full points if you did what we were talking about.
What was the new and old immigration here?
The way they're living.
I think it was the shift between in 1865 we had the old immigration of people coming from England, people coming from like Stewart is an English surname, if you guys knew that. So this could sort of represent the old immigration at the bottom, whilst the upper image represents the new immigration of the poor Slavic people, the poor Irish and the poor Italians living in sort of the tenements and sort of living in those
What's
slums.
the reaction?
The like the reaction to this discrepancies.
Right, like how, like what's the verb in the reaction then? Like is what I was getting at.
Still the reaction. Well, I mean the
It's
reaction.
obviously rich and poor, but what I'm saying.
The reaction was to put the old, like put the new into the tenements. So like put these people in like assembly, like poor like jobs, like welfare sort of things, like the political machine you could also bring up for the new immigration. But I think we did the SAQ very well.
The laptop's about to die.
I what?
It's about to die.
Chargers are on the floor.
Torres, you took one block.
I might have.
I think mine is.
It's called a charger, not a block.
No, he took the.
Oh, you took the. Man.
Listen, man, I was getting a mission.
So let's do a review question and then we're done. So the first review question is, what is a scallywag? Does anyone know?
Scallywag?
Scallywag.